With that, I want to welcome you to session 3 of the Americas series, which is a session of a seminar with 5 sessions looking at American, which is in the broadest sense, North, Central, and South American navies, coast guards, maritime security issues, to discuss some of the challenges, some of the opportunities that these navies and forces face, and these countries really, and to try to discuss some implications that these issues have for Europe and for NATO in particular. My name is Sebastian Bruns. I'm the head of the Center for Maritime Strategy and Security at the Institute for Security Policy at Kiel University. I know that's a very long title. The ISPK is located in northern Germany, and it's continental Europe's only think tank that has a sea power center, and it's a non-for-profit, and it's been around for a few years now. I have been in this position since 2016. I want to welcome you to this session today, which is very conveniently lodged between the NATO Defense Ministers meeting yesterday and the virtual Munich Security Conference tomorrow. So I appreciate Secretary General Stoltenberg adjusting his schedule and that of the defense ministers accordingly. And we will discuss today, we were going to discuss 2 countries. We'll discuss at least one country and its navy that underwrite the Atlantic in North Atlantic Treaty Organization, namely Canada, and hopefully if Peter Dombrowski does show up in the course of the event, then we'll discuss the US Navy as well. Again, we might reschedule that if circumstances require us so. Our first speaker, and someone I'm really excited to have on this call today, is Timothy Choi. He's a PhD candidate at the University of Calgary's Center for Military Security and Strategic Studies, where his dissertation employs a broadened notion of sea control to analyze the influence of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea on the force structure and peacetime operations of 3 Arctic countries, namely Denmark, Canada, and Norway. His latest publication is Danish Naval Evolution in the Arctic, Developments Through the Unipolar Moment, and Kennedy and Wilson's Navies in Multipolar Worlds by Routledge. He also had a chapter in the Canadian Maritime Forces in Grey and White Hulls by Bowers and Co., as well as articles in the Arctic Yearbook and in the Arctic Yearbook, and Ocean Development and International Law. He serves as a board member of the Canadian Naval Review and is also its photo editor. And if you, I very much encourage you to read Timothy's stuff, but I also encourage you to look at his pictures, which are very, very gorgeous and just great works of art. Timothy, it's great to have you here. The floor is yours, and we'll just play along as we go from here. And we're really look forward to your discussion. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks a lot, Sebastian, and thank you everyone else for coming as well. It's always it's been a long time coming to actually speak at a Kiel event, and a lot of the time until now it's been how can I find some reason to come to Kiel to give a talk? Well, thankfully the pandemic's given me at least a free reason to present at this event. So I recognize some familiar names in the audience, and I think for most of you, this what I'm going to be talking about here about Canada is going to be pretty much old hat, and I really structured this presentation to be sort of a general briefing for our European friends, European and American friends. Sorry, I'm going to turn off my Outlook so it's not pinging away. There we go. Okay. And yeah, so it's going to be pretty much quite familiar to most Canadians what I'm going to be talking about here, but hopefully there'll still be something of interest nonetheless, and we can probably go into more details during the Q&A session. But otherwise, I'm going to try to keep to a fairly brief 15-20 minute talk about the Royal Canadian Navy and its the current context in which it operates, and of course ongoing force structure developments. So that's going to be the focus of my presentation here today. And you can all see the presentation is fine, yes? Okay, great. Thanks, Sebastian. So here's a general outline I'm going through. So basically Canada's general geopolitical situation, just to give you a sense of what is it that we're dealing with at, in the broadest sense, that very important constraint enabler of a country's foreign and security policy, basically its geography. And then it's followed by Canada's, the Navy's main guiding strategic documents. And then we'll talk a little bit about, well, what sort of Navy is the RCN? Is it a medium Navy, a large Navy, a smaller Navy? There are different opinions on and takes and interpretations of those, not least because different scholars have come up with different ways of measuring these sorts of things. And then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of what is the force structure of the Canadian Navy, what is it actually capable of doing, and then moving on into, well, the transition towards the future fleet that will take the RCN through most of the rest of the 21st century. And then we'll conclude with a little bit of talks about how this future fleet will slot into, or how it will compare with NATO and European force structures. So I'm starting off here with this lovely photo of HMCS Regina and one of our Halifax class frigates, of which we have 12. And the Halifax class, of course, formed the backbone of Canada's combat forces, or naval combat forces. And general purpose frigates, we can go a little bit more about the details of the armaments and capabilities about that later, but they're your standard ocean-going, wide-ranging, long-range patrol frigates with decent multi-mission capabilities all around. And I use Regina, this particular photo of Regina, not only because she looks gorgeous in that beautiful World War II disruptive camouflage pattern, which was put on this last year, in commemoration of Canada's participation in the Battle of the Atlantic in the Second World War. And this particular camouflage pattern was worn by some of our destroyers during that time, especially while they were contributing to the forces at D-Day during Operation Overlord. So that's sort of the historical context of the RCN that we're always keeping in the back of our mind, that yes, Canada has a Navy, and we've long used it in a very much a sort of force projection and alliance capacity far away from Canada's own shores. And so with that, we can start talking about Canada's unique geographic location. It is much like the United States. We have, two massive moats on either side of us. We have the Atlantic and Pacific. And of course, we also have the Arctic as well. And despite all the, heated discussions about the Arctic warming up and opening access for the sea lanes up north and increase the ease of access to North America, it's still a fairly difficult territory to go through in order to reach North American shores from the Arctic. And so all around Canada, we're fairly secluded from any major maritime threats. There is very little that we can think of in a realistic sense in terms of any kind of naval invasion that Canada faces, or any sort of attack from the maritime spaces. And so it is with that, sort of geographical security that allows Canada to be a provider, actually, of alliance assistance rather than being a recipient of one in most general situations. And so, that is enabled by the fact that, of course, our long border with the United States means that the Americans have a self-interest in guaranteeing Canadian security. And in that sense, of course, the Americans, or rather Canadians, don't have to work overly hard to ensure that Americans are willing to ensure Canada's security. Because, of course, as we were more or less familiar during the Cold War, Soviet bombers would have to fly through the Canadian Arctic and Canadian South to reach the United States homeland. And so, Canada's security is America's security. And so in some sense, Canada has that terrible, feeling of being a sort of a free rider on that American security provision, just because, well, America doesn't really want to depend on Canada's, ability to defend the North American continent by itself. Well, I don't, probably not. And so, America will always have its own interests in ensuring that the northern approaches, at the very least, to the North American continent are always secure. from any potential threat in that sense. And of course, Canada is a founding member of NATO, and so we always contribute forces to alliance operations, whether it's Afghanistan or in, more recently, just measures to help bolster alliance military measures in Europe as well. And so we, Canada contributes forces to both of these things. And it's not so much about Canada being a desperate recipient of military aid in time of war. And so it's within this geographical and this geopolitical context that we really have Canada as sort of this military power where it has a great deal of freedom in where it becomes involved. And so it really enables us to have an internationalist foreign policy where we're not really, there's no real one particular thing to concentrate our threat analysis on. And we are a fairly unique situation. We're a medium power far away from any areas of actual threat, realistic threat, protected by, a global hegemon, a superpower of self-interest. And it makes it really hard for us to actually think about what to actually prioritize our military to defend ourselves against. And so you kind of, contrast ourselves with, say Denmark in the, in the Cold War, where it was very clear, their one role or major role was to, concentrate their forces in the Baltic and in, Danish Straits to prevent the Soviet Baltic fleet from breaking out into the North Sea. That was very narrow, very well constrained, that was it. For Canada, during the Cold War, it was very much about, anti-submarine warfare, escorting convoys across the North Atlantic to ensure they can reach Europe. But, if that were to have failed, it was not as though, the Soviet invasion forces would have came across the Atlantic to invade North America, at least in many of the situations and conceptions of what would have happened. And so, and even today, of course, that situation is even freer, one might say, in terms of what are the actual military conventional threats to Canada. And it's in that context that we really are able to reach out globally, project our maritime forces to contribute to things here, there, and everywhere, but not in any particular concentration of ways, shall we say. And so from a threat-based perspective, it can mean either two things for Canada. It means there's very little impetus or very little obvious impetus to spend money on defense, or we end up spending money on basically everything and anything in preparation for whatever might happen in a broad sense elsewhere in the world. And we really sort of see this tension and confusion in what exactly is it that Canada uses its military for in our strategic guidance documents. And so we start here actually with a document on the right, which is Leadmark 2050. It came out in 2016. It's the Navy's own guiding document. And basically it calls for a blue water Navy to, quote, its purpose is to defend the global system at sea and from the sea, both at home and abroad. I mean, just think about that phrase, right? It's literally a phrase that tells us the Canadian Navy should be able to do basically everything and anything to uphold the global system. Right, there's nothing in that statement. Of course, the document goes into a lot more details about what underpins it, but basically it's incredibly ambitious, and it says we should be able to contribute something to everywhere and anywhere, to do a little bit of everything to make sure that the global system, that Western powers and most of the world's powers, our prosperity depends upon. Great, but what are the primary threats to that system? Is there any particular one thing that we should concentrate on? It's like, well, not really. And so you really end up with, as we shall see later, a very large variety of means to accomplish that. And in essence, Leadmark 2050, it really tells us to talk about, it separates Canadian defense into maybe 3 geographic regions. It's protecting Canada's own sovereignty in its home waters, so within Canada itself, to help secure the maritime approaches to North America, so that's the second tier, and then contribute to peace and global order abroad. So in doing this, it's not just about protecting Canada at home and in the near region, but also to project Canadian power from the sea to ensure that global peace and good order. So power projection is a major function of Canadian forces, but not necessarily in the same sense, of course, as say an American aircraft carrier, right? It's very much about projecting our ability to be present in areas of, general global order of interest. Here is their of interest to maintain a global order abroad. Oftentimes more in cases of, so what we call soft security issues of, counter piracy and counter drug smuggling. And you'll see we participate in a lot of those measures. And the separation between Canada, North America, and the globe is really reflected in the slightly newer strong, secure, and engaged, and that's our general defense policy. I won't go into too many details about that, but the two are fairly well aligned in that respect, that separation of where Canada needs its military forces. Now, well, we're running over time for me, but of course, the RCN is, it's a very large or fairly large Navy in terms of its major surface combatants, which we'll go into in the next slide. But basically how at least the Navy thinks of itself is very much as a medium global force projection Navy. And you see that in Lead March 2020, which came out back in 2001, which, in addition to what most of the scholarly literature focused on in terms of ranking navies, it added this temporal aspect of sea power. So it's not just about the number of ships you have, it's not about what each of your ships can do, but it's also how often you do it, how frequently you do it. And so it's not just about the potential of what navies can do, but what they actually do on a day-by-day basis. And really the main argument of, categorizing the RCN, despite its fairly small number of hulls, is that it, as a medium Navy, is that it does constantly conduct persistent global deployments, right? And so you see here in these two photos I have, they're all from this year, even in the midst of the global pandemic. Where at the bottom there, we have one of our frigates, one of Halifax class, sailing alongside a pair of German vessels as part of Operation Reassurance in Europe. And at the top, we have HMCS Winnipeg, another one of our frigates, out in the Indo-Pacific region, conducting Op Projection Neon, which is our operation to help enforce the sanctions against North Korea to make sure they're not smuggling oil at sea, et cetera, and it's sailing, of course, next to a Japanese destroyer. And so, we do this on a constant basis globally, almost, every month of the year. And there are some exceptions, especially right now with COVID, but generally we're always present abroad in some form or fashion, which very few other countries can say. I mean, even if you look at, the Royal Navy in Great Britain, there was a significant stint of time in the last decade where it didn't really have much in the way of a combat force, east of Suez. And for a Navy like Canada to actually be able to deploy constantly throughout and actually be present on a daily basis, that's no small feat, right? But that what the Navy does is a little bit different from what the country thinks it does and how the country thinks about its Navy. And so looking at J.R. Hill's concept of the medium power theory, where he really focused on how is this state's perception of self, and much of what makes a medium power is a degree of autonomy, a fairly high degree of autonomy in terms of its aims and strategic aspirations. And of course, the question for us is, does Canada's political leaders, does the Canadian people, do we see ourselves as having that level of autonomy to actually dictate, the prime mover of actions to guarantee, Canada's existence as an entity? And I would say probably not. And our fleet certainly reflects that, right? So while our Navy sees itself as a medium Navy, our country doesn't really behave as a medium power with the level of autonomy that implies. And so correspondingly, our naval funding reflects a Navy that's seen by the government to cater to a less than autonomous entity that will always be beholden to our allies for some major functions, such as amphibious or naval aviation, or really high-end sea control. And I mean, there's some willingness to go beyond that in recent years, but it remains to be seen how it will actually be carried out. And so we'll go into a bit about the current fleet here. 12 Halifax class frigates, which compares favorably. I mean, you look at most of Europe's, larger naval powers, having 12 ocean-going, combatants of around, it's like 5,000, 6,000 tons. Not a lot of them have that, but we do. Unfortunately, we have to split them up to east and west coast. So on the east coast, we have 7, west coast have 5. And these are supported by 12 Kingston-class maritime coastal defense vessels, which are the ones in, these ones here, 1, 2, and 3. So this is a shot from our exercise that took place recently of the west coast of Canada. So this is our Pacific Fleet, and the ships are currently able to basically be at a high level of readiness and is ready to deploy. And this are, the surface fleet is supported by 4 Kingston-class, diesel electric submarines that we bought from the Brits and have been, going through a fairly lengthy period of teething troubles to get underway with various levels of success. And all of this is supported right now by 1 AOR, and that's a leased vessel that we converted from a container vessel a couple of years back while we actually worked on building the replacements. So we're not autonomous in all naval missions, but we're also not as pathetic as most Canadians will believe us to be. And actually, in a comparative sense, we made it through the post-Cold War shrinkage of Western navies quite well. You think about, again, using the senior service, the Royal Navy in Britain as their point of comparison. I think they, at the end of the Cold War, their surface combat fleet was nearing somewhere around 50 ships. And then, today they're at pushing barely 19. Whereas, for Canada, we went from 19 down to 12, but, our 12 frigates was dramatically more capable than what their Cold War counterparts are capable of in terms of, multi-mission capabilities, anti-surface, anti-air, anti-submarine warfare. So being able to do all these things, whereas, our Cold War fleet was very much, single-purpose vessels for the most part of it, it means we actually did quite well. But of course, the big issue for us is that, we have 2 coasts, makes it very difficult to concentrate the fleet, whether it's for operations or for flexibilities and maintenance cycle. And so effectively, we have you can argue that we have actually 2 smaller navies in the fleet organization and structure rather than 1 medium one. But, collectively, nonetheless, enables a persistent global operation while retaining local and regional presence. And actually, I just want to point out that for our little coastal defense vessels here, supposedly coastal, they're only 800 tons or so. We've been using them to actually for more globe-spanning operations, including in Europe and in West Africa, where they're conducting maritime security training for local forces. So we've been learning how to make do with this fleet in a fairly wide number of ways. So that's our current forces. And of course, right now, we're in the midst of a massive fleet renewal under the so-called national shipbuilding strategy that's been going on for the last 10 years and will continue to be going on for at least the next 20 to 30 years. And of course, crown jewel for this is the 15 Canadian surface combatant that will replace the Halifax-class frigates and the air defense destroyers that were taken offline earlier this decade. And of course, it's based on Type 26. And it's equipped with, but the major difference from the Type 26 is the equipment of the SPY-7 active electronically scanned radar that will give them basically the same range as American Aegis destroyers in terms of sensors, with even better, fidelity and degree of, quality of data that the radars will provide. And so basically, we're upgrading from 12 general purpose frigates to 15 really high-end air defense and anti-submarine destroyers, one might even say. So it's a drastic improvement in capability, all of which, of course, depends on our ability and our willingness to actually fund them, which is kind of always a hot topic in Canadian politics as to whether, this was actually the best choice, whether we actually need, 15 air defense destroyers. But, if it does pan out, it means we do have actually ships that can do quite a lot of everything in accordance with our fairly ambitious, naval strategic guidance documents to do that sort of thing. So, just some quick rundown of specs. Of course, 32 Mark 41 cells, in addition to 6 quad-pack Sea Scepter cells. So, arguably, that's 24 extra missiles there as well. So, in terms of actually loadout, we have our ESSMs, what we currently use on our Halifax class, backed up by SM2 Block 3C, so the latest variants with active homing. And of course, the most politically contentious one in the future would be the Tomahawk cruise missile, giving Canada that 1,000 nautical mile reach inland to attack targets there, and supported by usual suite of anti-ship and anti-submarine weapons as well. But that's, we're not going to lay down steel for that for at least another 4 years, hopefully. And in the meantime, the shipyard that's building them, Irving Shipbuilding in Halifax, are working on these guys, these fairly thick, chunky boys, as we like to call them. Sort of cute, actually, in their roundness. And the DRD, of course, the Harry the Wolf Arctic and offshore patrol ships, 6,600 tons, which makes them, displace more even than our Halifax class frigates, although a little bit shorter. And we're building 6 of them for the RCN and 2 for Canadian Coast Guard in an unarmed variant. And so basically they have a fairly robust ice operational capability, working in the medium first year ice up to 120 centimeters. And right now, Harry the Wolf, which we see in this photo, she's currently doing her ice trials off of, in the Davis Straits. So we look forward to seeing how that pans out. But they match fairly well in terms of ice capability with other Arctic patrol ships. So we can talk more about details in Q&A if you'd like. Although the armament is somewhat weaker, but my argument is always, well, the point of a patrol ship is always to try to not ruin things that you're there to defend. And so, environmental protection, for instance, doesn't really cater to, having a large caliber gun that might make things worse. So, having a small 25mm cannon, that's basically all you need to, ensure that civilian violations of, your sovereignty, that they can be stopped. I mean, no fishing vessel or polluting vessel is going to, run the risk of being shot by, any armament, really, especially 25mm. So, that's more than adequate for the law enforcement and constabulary missions that, the Harry the Wolf class are being meant for. And of course, backing this up will be the 2 Berlin class joint support ships, or AOR. So we're just using the German plans and drawings and design for those, for our future fleet replenishment vessels. And so quick conclusion, and what does this mean for NATO and Europe? Well, much as the Halifax class marked a dramatic increase in multi-mission capabilities across the Canadian fleet, so too will our Canadian Surface Combatant, our Type 26 derivative, just in one very small, narrow scope of capabilities. Just comparing that is, of course, the maximum anti-air warfare missile loadout per ship. It goes from our current 16 ESSMs for Halifax class to a maximum of, if you want to really max out ESSMs, it'll be 128 of those things inside those 32 Mark 41 missile cells, plus the 24 sea sectors for it. I mean, you can do the math yourself. So that's an incredible increase in, air warfare capabilities per vessel in Canada. Of course, more realistically, you're going to balance that out with a bunch of, air-to-air defense missiles and some Tomahawks. But nonetheless, it's a massive sea change in what every single ship in Canadian Navy can do. And so even if, Canadian political appetite for a whole fleet of 15 replacements is not there, at least each of those individual vessels can do the job of, multiple frigates at a time. In terms of numbers, if we build all 15, that's 7 to 8 CSCs on each coast, and compare that with the Royal Navy's 8 of their own Type 26, which are less capable, plus their 6 Type 45s. In some cases, you can arguably make the case that we have a slightly smaller version of the RN's own combat fleet on each of our coasts. So that's a fairly robust capability that can contribute to, basically any alliance operation for sea control and a small bit of force projection as well, thanks to the Tomahawks. And of course, on all this is, it helps us maintain Canada's role as frequent, flagships within the standing NATO maritime groups, as we see in this photo. But of course, as I mentioned, all this depends upon continual government appetite on spending, not least because of COVID. So it's an incredibly ambitious, fleet replenishment plan, recapitalization plan, but we'll see whether it continues and whether subsequent governments will have the appetite to carry it through for the next 15 years while we build up the fleet. So thank you, and I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Tim, for an absolutely brilliant presentation. Very much appreciated. I'm kind of sad that we couldn't bring you to Kiel at this time in person, but hopefully we'll be able to do that in the very near future. And with the wonders of the 21st century, namely VTCs, at least we're able to have this conversation virtually. And I believe, as you and I have been discussing prior to this event, certainly in Europe, we know dangerously little about Canadian naval dynamics and the Canadian Navy. I mean, it was quite a sight to see HMCS Toronto in Kiel. I think last year in the summer, due to COVID, there was no open ship as I would have liked, and certainly my colleagues at ISPK would have liked it as well. But this has been just a fascinating thing to have a conversation about. Lots of things to pick apart. We will go ahead with the Q&A now, and the suggestion here is that you'll, when you have a question, please put it in the chat function, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen, and I'll keep a list, and then you can we'll work through the list with the questions and the comments you might have. And if I can ask you one thing, please introduce yourself very briefly, just stating your name and, if applicable, who you work for, and then we'll go from there. And the first question is from Heinz-Dieter Jopp. Please unmute yourself and ask your question. We can't hear you. Oh, there you go.
Okay,
yeah.
now it's on. Yeah, I have two questions. Maybe it's allowed to put the two questions to you, Tim. First of all, many thanks for your presentations. I missed a little bit, and that will be my first question, a little bit more to say about the Arctic, because in the last, I would say not only months, but in the last years, there's a growing rumor at a minimum that Russia, but also China have a growing interest in that region. And their interests in the region are not common with our interests. So how will you, as a state, try to, it's difficult to say, or maybe say, because we are speaking about the Navy, how to defend against Russian and Chinese interest to send more military power in that region. And the second question is more in the direction of your mentioning of that you are planning for the new frigates, the Sea Launched Cruise Missile, the Tomahawk. As far as I have read and heard, there are also some ideas in the US Navy that they will bring back to their Tomahawks the nuclear warhead. And then I have the feeling then you are running as a country in difficulties, because and Tomahawk you can't see from the outside if it is a nuclear warhead or a conventional warhead. Now, are you discussing that issue too? Thanks.
Thanks, Heinz. Those are some really good questions there. So the Arctic is always a very popular topic for people to discuss today. And the important thing is that the Arctic is not a uniform, homogeneous region. And perhaps the biggest difference is what we like to consider the North American Arctic versus the European high north, the European Arctic, where, of course, the European Arctic is very much where, you know, Russia needs to be strong at. That's where a lot of its trade goes through, and, you know, on its way to and from Murmansk. That's where its nuclear deterrent is based out of. That's where its economic lifeblood is, right? I mean, the major reason why Russia cares about the Arctic so much is because it's, you know, it's responsible for something like 30% of its oil and gas exports, right? And so it needs to be sure that it can treat that, our entire Arctic coastline as basically its own front yard, because for them, it is their own front yard. That is where their life, their economic lifeblood depends upon. And so, it makes total sense why Russia would always seek to try to have the upper hand in, along the Arctic coastline. So, see them militarizing their bases, equipping them with missiles and all the rest of it. But in terms of, are they actually going to, try to seize Arctic, territories or Arctic maritime spaces from other countries in the region? I don't really see it, mostly because it is actually in Russia's own interest to ensure that everyone plays by the UNCLOS rules. Because the vast majority of those Arctic resources, oil and gas, mineral resources, are within your EEZ. Something like 95% of known Arctic resources are within our exclusive economic zones. And so it is in Russia's interest that, that we all respect, and play by the EEZ rules instead of trying to reach out too far into the center of the Arctic, where one is incredibly uneconomical, right? Because the Central Arctic is where there's still sea ice throughout, year round, and there still will be, even as global climate change takes its toll. And so if you're Russia and you want to, extract Arctic resources, why would you spend, an enormous amount of money to get that remaining 5% of oil and gas? It's completely uneconomical. And so, all the notions of there being a race for Arctic resources, not so much, and not so much from that military, grab what we can perspective. And it's very much a case of, Russia being much more interested in making sure that everyone plays by the rules, that Western liberal order, and UNCLOS up in the Arctic in that sense. And of course, you can talk about, during Cold War, of course, there's concern that, the Russians will go through the Arctic, and the Arctic was space for, high-end, combat. But you always have to remember that the Arctic back then was very much about a space through which military conflict will go. And it's not about a fight for the Arctic, it's a fight over and through the Arctic. Nobody in, with the exception, of course, of the European Arctic, in the North American Arctic, it was never about fighting for the North American Arctic. It was simply a space. It was simply a space for us to conduct sort of a defense in depth to the extent that one could in the age of air and missile warfare. So those are some of the 2 points there. And so really I think in terms of the Chinese threat to the Arctic, or the Chinese threat to Western interests in the Arctic, is much less on the military side and much more, of course, on the economic and political side, right? And of course, you think about Greenland and how their airports are, crumbling into the ground. And so you're thinking about, well, who's going to fund the rapid replacement that's necessary to rebuild those airports? Well, of course, China is always happy to take money in return for future unspecified political favors. And so that's, of course, where one element of great power competition really needs to take place, is in that economic space there as well. So on the Tomahawk question, our Navy's been pretty hush-hush on what they're actually thinking about this thing. And certainly in terms of, the political leadership, have they even thought about this thing? I'm not confident at all that they have. And it's very much, I'm sure it's just an option that the Navy has proposed, and that we'll see, how well received that will be by the political leaders future down the road. And of course, when we talk about buying these things, I highly doubt, anyone will think Canada will equip them with a nuclear warhead, not least because you have to have the permissive action links and all the rest of the back end system that needs to be incorporated into the ships. And that's, there's a lot there that needs to take place, and a lot of space, a lot of things, a lot of items that can easily leak out into the public realm for public knowledge. If we were to actually do that. So I'm not too concerned about us getting nuclear Tomahawks.
Thank you, Tim. Two items of interest. First, at least 3 more questions, but also it's my pleasure to welcome Peter Dombrowski to this call. So I suggest the following. Randy Papadopoulos, if you could pose your question, and afterwards I have a question by Alan Darlington. So if you two gentlemen could themselves one after the other in the order I just called, pose your question to Tim, Then we'll go to Peter Dombrowski's presentation, and then we'll have an opportunity, as time allows, to pose some more questions, especially the third one by Jeremy Sturz, if that's okay with you all.
Thank you, Sebastian. I'm Randy Papadopoulos. I am the Secretariat Historian for the Department of the Navy, but these are, of course, my opinions only. I very much appreciated your presentation, Tim, and the fleet architecture, as I would term it here, that you outlined in your discussion. I found myself actually riding on the coattails of Captain Yop, because I too was going to ask about the Tomahawk land attack missile. As an American who grew up in Canada, when the idea of the US Air Force testing Tomahawks over Canadian airspace was considered radically provocative during the late Cold War. I remember this. Believe me, the idea of putting Tomahawks on RCN ships sounds wonderful to me, but I wonder about the politics of it. But my question is much more about the fleet that you outlined, and given that the plan that you outlined for the future fleet, would you only see then the only chance for Canadian unilateral action to be in the Arctic, or maybe for sovereignty protection, with the Canadian surface combatants that specifically that you outlined being reserved for either NATO alliance or UN missions of an expeditionary sort? I wonder if that's what the fleet the RCN is trying to build is going to be. Thank you.
Thank you. Colin?
Thank you. Colin Darlington, Royal United Services Institute of Nova Scotia, fellow RUSI member to Tim. Good to see you again, Tim, after yesterday. So, and it's a variation actually of the previous question in some respects, but Tim, what are your thoughts on the RCN seagoing logistics capability as we now have it with Asterix, and the future as the Protector class get built, in support of the Navy as a blue water Navy that is capable of far afield and long endurance deployable operations? Because I think that's truly what a blue water Navy is. So we tend to focus on the front end combatants, but I think part of a measure of a Navy is just what its support is at sea and truly even ashore, whether that be the fleet maintenance facilities or even the harbor service. Of course, one of the keelings that's about to occur in the next week or so will be the first of the 4 large Navy tugs, and that's an important capability too. Thank you.
Sebastian, did you want me to answer them now, or do you want to
go ahead? Yeah, go ahead, Tim, if you could. Okay. Thank you.
So it's an interesting part that both of your questions can be more or less answered at the same time, and it really falls under the Canadian, in the lead mark and SSE's own conceptions of what our Navy should come together to do as a fleet. And in SSE, it called for 2 independent Canadian task groups. So 3 service combatants supported by one of our logistics support ships, and along with a submarine whenever we get them working. And so that's that is the independent task force that Canada is looking to do outside of the Arctic. In terms of globe spanning sort of operations. But of course, you know, it's very unlikely that Canada will ever send its combat fleet to do anything sort of on its own. It will always be under the aegis or guidance, auspices of some alliance or coalition engagement. And so, you know what, in terms of is it necessary for us to have that autonomous full spectrum naval warfare capability? You know, probably not. You know, there's always this debate about whether a country's Navy should be able to do a bit of everything or whether it should concentrate on any specific role, right? And for Canada, historically, more or less, it's been that ASW capability. And of course, we're ensuring that the CSEs will have that to the fullest extent possible for service combatant, while also ensuring, of course, that, you know, air defense capability, which, by the way, you know, it's hard to separate from ASW these days because of the cruise missile capabilities that submarines have. So, you know, if you want to be a robust and reliable sub-hunter, then you also have to be able to defend yourself very well against cruise missiles as well. And so this, you know, at some point, you know, when, you know, right now in Canada, we have this parliamentary budget officer he's putting out a report next week about the cost of the Canadian service combatant and comparing them with the Type 31 in Britain and the FREM. You know, they're going to talk about, you know, those trade-offs about capabilities and costs. And it's one of those things where if you actually look at the convergence of different weapons and capabilities on board in various domains, it becomes very clear that any vessel that seeks to be really good at one thing also has to be fairly decently good at all the other domains of warfare as well. And so to just elaborate a little bit more on that logistics element, of course, one of the interesting things I noted during this past decade was Canada's ability to actually send our Halifax class abroad on global operations, even without a working logistics vessel. And there was a brief 2 or 3 year period in the middle of this decade when we lost the use of our old Cold War era supply ships because of fires and accidents and whatnot, and until the Asterix, the conversion, was completed. And so, but we didn't stop, sending our ships abroad, even though actually the Halifax class was undergoing their fleet-wide midlife upgrade. We still send them abroad, thanks in part, of course, to our American and Chilean and Spanish allies who, lend us the use of their support ships whenever we need to go abroad. And of course, that global network of ports and reliable allies that we can actually leverage and use. And so it's that sense of, Canadian sea power is not, and making a blue water navy. It's not just about having the individual assets that makes global spanning operations possible, but also, of course, the political, the alliance work, naval diplomatic function elements that is a major enabler of what the RCN does. And so, we look at the classic Canadian or classic naval theory literature, we talk about, the military, the diplomatic, and the constabulary missions as functions of navies, but we don't talk about them as, inputs to what navies can do. And so I'll argue that, this, our ability to, in this past decade to send ships abroad, even without AORs, is a perfect example of how, a robust diplomatic presence is a massive enabler of what limited resources or a navy can actually accomplish. So yeah, I think I'll leave it at that one.
Thank you, Tim. As I mentioned, we'll take the rest of the questions after the presentation by Peter Dombrowski, who has joined us. I understand his camera is not working, but his microphone will be. I assume, Peter, can you make yourself known?
Hi, can everybody hear me?
We can hear you all right, wonderful. I'll just briefly introduce you. And then we'll go from there. It's a pleasure to have you, Peter. Peter Dombrowski is the director of the Cyber and Innovation Policy Institute, and he's a professor of strategy in the Strategic and Operational Research Department at the U.S. Naval War College. Previous positions included chair of the Strategic Research Department, editor of the Naval War College Review, co-editor of International Studies Quarterly, and associate professor of political science at Iowa State University. Dombrowski is the author of over 65 publications, and his most recent book is The End of Grand Strategy, U.S. Maritime Operations in the 21st Century. This is why I love my job. I can just hold into the camera. This is what we do as academics, mostly. It was published in 2018. It's a very good book. It was published by Cornell. He received his BA from Williams College and an MA and a PhD from the University of Maryland. Peter, it's a pleasure to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Sebastian. I'd like to blame this presentation problem on the U.S. Navy because we have to use MS Teams in our professional presentations, and I think it's wreaking havoc with my cameras and everything else. I'm going to try to put up my slides, and if that doesn't work, I will simply talk to them and take questions as they come. So let's see if I work my slides, share screen. Can you see my slides?
Not yet.
Oh, this is just a disaster. I am so sorry. Let me try one more time. Now?
Negative. Sorry.
Okay, so you're going to have a disembodied voice talking in a disembodied way. My apologies, but hopefully we'll be able to deal with the substance well. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about the U.S. Navy. Obviously, that's the topic. And what I'm going to do is present portions of a paper I'm currently writing that's sort of an assessment of the Navy and what's happened to it over the course of the period from President Trump's running for office in the 2016 period to the beginning of the Biden administration. The title of the paper is going to be Strategic Renaissance or False Dawn, the U.S. Navy and International Security. Now, before I explain what I mean by all that, I do have to give the usual disclaimer that this is my own work entirely and not the official positions of the United States government, the Navy, or any other department or agency. What I'll do is I'll talk about, what I'm calling or positing is the so-called strategic renaissance for the Navy, beginning with Trump's running for office, explain why this might be a false dawn, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what allies and partners outside of the American navalists and the American Officer Corps need to know about this period. So let me talk a little bit about what the evidence for Renaissance, or what we can also say is a renewal. One of the things that then candidate Trump did was, for a very rare moment in American presidential campaign history, actually called out the Navy and called to build a 355 ship Navy. And this was the first time in quite some number of campaigns when a presidential candidate actually delved into the Navy as a campaign issue. It was a fairly minor one, but amongst the people that follow the Navy and amongst the Sea Service of the United States, this was very welcome news. And if you think about it, during that period, I didn't actually look up the exact figures, but the actual numbers of ships in the Navy in 2016 was somewhere around 300. Whether it was 306 or 288 really depended upon the day and depended on how you counted. But basically, then candidate Trump was saying, we're going to have a substantial expansion of the fleet. Congress eventually codified the president's demand for 355 in the National Defense Authorization Act, which authorized over time, not immediately, obviously, given the slowness of shipbuilding, 355 is sort of the headline goal. But it did not substantially appropriate more funds to begin this drive in a short period, but it was considered to be by 2035. The other evidence of renewal was that both of the Trump major strategic documents, the National Security Strategy and the National Defense Strategy, focus, as everybody in this audience knows, on great power competition. And great power competition was largely Russia and, more importantly, China. Now, writing about this at the time, I critiqued that, really Russia is not the same kind of great power and doesn't present the same sorts of challenges to the United States as China does, but it was great power competition nonetheless. As my colleague John Cavalier and I wrote in a security studies article in Special Issue last year, the real competitor was China. And if we're going to compete with China, and if we were fearful of an escalatory problem or potentially war, it was going to be competition in the military realm, and escalation and potentially war. It would take place at sea, right? There are no land borders. The United States doesn't have major allies that would pose a land-based challenge to China. It's a littoral competition. It's the Western Pacific. It's along the first and second island chains, which includes many key allies like Japan, China, and so on and so forth. So the point of raising this was the Trump administration recognized bluntly for the first time the challenge posed by China. And I'm not going to go into the rise and modernization of the PLAN, but I think most of this audience are well aware. There's been blog posts going on. My colleague Andrew Erickson at the Naval War College just put on Twitter, something that many of you know, that the actual sheer size of the PLAN actually exceeds that of the United States. Now, that's a calculated calculus because it's just numbers of hulls. You have to talk about tonnage, you have to talk about VLS tubes and all sorts of things. But the point is, over the last 2 to 3 decades, the PLA is mounting a serious challenge to the United States Navy, and a serious challenge particularly focused in the Western Pacific. So this was the beginning of renewal. However, and this is something we can talk about in the Q&As, unfortunately, there was a series of missteps. Something that really couldn't have been predicted when at the beginning of the Trump terms is the Navy was beset by a series of scandals and crises. One of them was the Fat Leonard scandal, which I don't really want to go into, but most of you have heard it. It was on logistics and the resupply in the Western Pacific. And then there was a series of collisions and so forth that really rocked the Navy because it got to the core of things like readiness, preparedness to go to sea, the training and education of our sailors and officer corps. And the Navy, was sort of set back on its heels as it thought about driving to 355 in this new competitive environment, particularly with China. More important for the story I'm telling is that there was a series of, when you're going to increase the size of the fleet, if you do it in a rationalistic fashion, you have sort of a design for the fleet. What should the fleet look like? What classes of ships should comprise it? How they should operate? What kinds of concept of operations? Where would they be deployed? The Navy did not have what the Congress and maybe some of the Trump administration considered a satisfactory future fleet architecture. So Congress intervened once again, and they asked 3 different organizations to provide examples of what the future fleet, the 355 and beyond, would look like. It was CSBA, which is a think tank in Washington. It was MITRE, which is a classic FFRDC, which is a federally funded research and development organization, and the Navy itself. And a series of studies, games, and TTXs took place to look at what this architecture looked like. But again, a lot of dissatisfaction with the results. Now, why do I talk about the possibility of, well, actually, let me roll back for a second. At the last minute, within the last 6 months of the Trump administration, there was a flurry of activity. First and foremost, the 3C services, the Coast Guard, the Navy, and the Marine Corps, on December 17th, 2020, issued Advantage at Sea, prevailing with an integrated all-domain naval power. This was a top-end tri-service strategic documents that some of you will remember in the past have included cooperative strategy for the 21st century. Its lineage goes all the way back to the Maritime Strategy of the 1980s. This was the Navy's view of how it would fight. Note the date, however, December 17th, 2020. President Trump had already been defeated. The Biden administration was coming on board. On December 9th, a few days earlier, the Navy had issued a 30-year shipbuilding plan. I will say the Navy issued it, but it was a much more complicated process, something I can't really go into, but basically this was the plan to achieve 355. Finally, and I heard in the last session you were talking about the Arctic, the Navy also issued another strategic document called the Blue Arctic. This was issued on January 5th, 2021, just a few short days before the Biden administration would take office. Finally, while all this is going on, there's lots of other small initiatives. Secretary Braithwaite floats the idea of creating a new fleet. The United States Marine Corps is driving to implement the Commandant Berger's vision, which he had issued about a year earlier. And so the point is, it seems like there's a sound foundation for the next administration and future generations. It's about great power conflict, increasing the size of the fleet, creating an integrated force that will generate more naval power during this competition with China and Russia. And we seem to finally, after almost 5 years, have a path forward. Just a little bit about shipbuilding, because this might interest people. Really what's happened, and I have a chart in front of me, I could go through it, but it's really hard without the visual, and I'm sorry for that. Basically what's going to happen is there would the new plan would create a force that kept the Air Force, kept the large deck CVNs, the carriers, maybe dropping slightly at the end of the period in 2035 to 2045, but would increase the number of small light carriers, a program that does not exist. It increased the number of unmanned systems of all sorts and optionally manned ships, including undersea and surface vessels. It increased the logistics force to include all sorts of both traditional logistics support ships and also unmanned support vessels. And within the boundaries of this, there was a lot of discussion about the various concepts for usage. So I know this is probably tedious without slides. Let me talk about why this is potentially a false dawn for the Navy. And I'll take any kinds of questions about the details. So first of all, increasing the size of the Navy is a very expensive proposition. And right now, the United States government, because of COVID and tax cuts, has a very large relative historically national debt. Its annual budget deficits have now increased substantially, largely because of the depredations of COVID, and also now the the spending plans to jumpstart the economy. The point being that the Navy is going to be competing with other priorities for its share of the budget. And I don't just mean its share of the budget in terms of domestic priorities and economic priorities, like critical infrastructure spending, but also within the overarching DoD budget. There's two ways of sort of ginning up more money to build a larger fleet on the part of the Navy. One is increasing the overall size of the DoD budget so that there's more to go around for everyone, or it's from taking budget from other services, which of course would be heartily resisted by everybody involved, including congressional allies, including within OSD, because it really, it would really upset a longstanding balance, which is basically a third budgets between the military services. So in the first place, if you're going to increase the size of the Navy, you have to recognize the problem of spending. And will the Biden administration prioritize military spending, or will it look to reduce annual budget deficits and the debt, the overall national debt as a whole? And will it have to spend on infrastructure, on COVID relief, and other kinds of priorities that have been set aside for the last 4 or 5 years? So this makes it a very difficult proposition to think about the shipbuilding side. I'm not even talking, as you can tell, some of you know, I understand that navies are much more than ships, but you can do the same sort of analysis with aircraft, with all the sorts of weapon systems and munitions and missiles that you would need to equip a fleet of this size, much less even including the fleet that exists today. So if you're looking to see what if you're looking to see where this is going to play out, and it's almost impossible to see it right now. We've heard some from Congress, a little bit from the administration. What international and domestic observers should look like, first and foremost, is the national security and national defense strategies that the Biden administration will release within the next year, I would think, maybe a little bit longer. One issue would be, does it continue to focus on great power rivalry? What's the nature of the competitive space? Does it require lots of forward deployed Does the new administration's strategy require forward deployed naval vessels, Navy vessels, Coast Guard, Marines? Does it take a less aggressive approach towards peacetime competition? All these questions will at least be implicit in the new strategic documents. The other thing to look at is, of course, Sino-American relations. The relations with the Chinese and the United States were very, very complex in the Trump administration and bordering on, well, let's just say very contentious over the last couple of years of the administration. The Biden administration shows signs in its early statement of backing off some of the more confrontational issues, but still the economic competition space remains incredibly important to the new administration. So to sort of wind this up, and I didn't really go through the advantage at sea, the new maritime tri-service strategy, but I'll get to that in this last few seconds. If you step back over, I've been working for the Navy for almost 25 years, and I've been following strategic and Navy developments at least that long. If you step back and look at where the US Navy is, and you think about it from the perspective of what outside observers see, leaving aside numbers of ships and all the concepts of operations and all that sort of stuff, what are the big themes? The first thing is great power conflict. I don't think this will go away in the Biden administration. I have no particular insight in that, but certainly if you go back to a cooperative strategy for the 21st century, already there were hints that the post-Cold War period was ending. The focus in the greater Middle East and post 9/11 was starting to diminish, and the American national security community, particularly the Navy, was starting to look at the rise of the PLAN and what would, in the next few years, become the revitalization of the Russian Navy, as limited as it was through top-end strategic documents and spending plans. So great power conflict is now an issue. The 1,000-ship Navy and all this sort of things that we saw in the early 2000s and before have sort of fallen back to the wayside. The second big theme is Indo-Pacific. You know, they changed the name of PACOM to the Indo-Pacific Command. We're thinking about a first fleet that may be dealing with the sort of seams between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. You can see this trend not just in the pivot that took place under the Obama administration, but carried out, shifting of resources and focus to the Pacific. Beyond shifting in focus and resources, there is the question of sort of thinking of this vast maritime space as a single space. One of the things navalists like to talk about is the fact that there really are no boundaries to fleet shifting from geography to geography, from sea to sea, from ocean to ocean. And we see this historically with the British and the Dutch. We see it historically with the American Navy. Now we're in the period of the Indo-Pacific for all the reasons most of you know. Another big trend. This was muted a bit in the last probably year, but prior to that, if you read Navy documents and you listen to the CNOs, Greenert, Richardson, even Gilday, there was discussion of what was called warfighting first, that the United States Navy, but also by de facto the Marines, had to think very carefully about the fact that there was a great power competitor that was very capable, and that to be successful in this environment, the Navy need to pay attention to the possibility of warfighting. Not just strikes from the sea to the land, but warfighting first at sea. And this ties to the next theme, the enduring strategic theme, which is readiness. Okay, there's a tremendous tension between being forward deployed, operating on a global scale, doing FONOPs and other kinds of operations, ports of call visits with allies and friends and partners, and maintaining readiness, keeping the fleet in fighting shape, keeping all equipment and ships properly maintained, thoroughly modernized, making sure that the sailors and officers are not overstressed with the periods of deployment, give them enough time when they're on land, on shore, to do the training and preparations for deployment again, that the whole readiness ball of wax, because some people argued that the United States Navy had sacrificed readiness to be forward and active and sacrificed readiness in terms of maintenance and so forth to be out there, and we needed to put more money against this problem. The final thing, and this is my get off the stage point, is all the strategic documents from the last 20 years focus on the importance of partners and allies. You could do a keyword search in any of them, not just cooperative strategy for the 21st century, but its successor in 2015, which was revised version, the FRAGOs, which are fragmentary orders issued by Admiral Richardson. You can see again and again and again the recognizing on the part of the Navy and its partners that we cannot maintain the competitive balance with great powers, much less fight a war or manage escalation without partners and allies. And this is right from the deck plate to the strategic level. And I think this is something we've already heard the Biden administration stress, and I suspect, in fact, I'm 90% sure this will be reflected in the US Navy's operational patterns and its top-end strategy documents, how it presents itself policy and politically to other navies and other national security establishments. So with that, I'll shut up. I hope that covered enough ground to offer questions. It was a little bit of an inward look presentation, but I'll take questions as they come up, and I'll try to get more granular depending on what your interests are.
Thank you very much, Peter. This was quite an exciting. That's quite an exciting paper that you're writing there. It's a topic that you know is near dear to my heart, and not least because it gives me the opportunity for a quick commercial break, because I happen to have written a book about U.S. Navy strategy up until 2016. So if you want to take a look at U.S. naval strategy and national security, the evolution of American maritime power, read that first, and then Peter's paper, or vice versa. The one comment I have before I open the floor really is there isn't really there's been the issue that an outgoing administration provides something of a document that's sort of left on the shelf for the new administration isn't really unprecedented. I'm thinking of I'm remembering the outgoing Bush senior administration back in 1992, 93. They proposed a fiscal year 94 DoD budget. It was more of a proposal, and I don't quite know. I haven't gotten the numbers here. How much of it was really reflected in the Clinton administration's budget proposal for that year then? If I remember it correctly, it was also the early 90s were also a period in which the U.S. Navy had a significant institutional crisis. But I think that's where the similarities end. Now, we've got about 15 minutes for further questions and answers. And I've got two people who are still on the list from early on. And can I please ask Jeremy Stöß and then Barry Walker to unmute themselves and pose a question. And please, if you could, keep it short and who it is addressed to. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for both of your presentations. Jeremy Stöß from ISPK. I wanted to find a great quote on how the U.S. Navy influences all the other navies globally. I just couldn't find it now. My question first to Tim, and thanks also to Peter's here. To Peter, and it ties together. How would you see, Tim first, how would you see the cooperation with the U.S. also in terms, maybe also personnel, of operating closely together? How is the Canadian Navy influenced by the US Navy, and specifically, because of course there are many aspects to that, specifically looking at the new capabilities coming, being now acquired, looking at the frigates with a greater air defense capabilities, something that many European navies are also looking at, and of course the US Navy as well. So being able to defend oneself against missile barrages. If you could just add maybe how those new frigates are also looking high energy laser systems, because I think that will be a key to defend oneself. And then to Peter, how or what does the US Navy need from the Canadian Navy, and how or what would it need from the Canadian Navy in its grand scheme of things, looking towards the future and looking to a great power competition and potential conflicts with peer and near-peer competitors, both in the European or the European theater as well as the Asia-Pacific theater. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeremy. Some great questions there. So speaking on CSC, or our future frigate/destroyer, one of the key components that we added is, of course, the cooperative engagement capability. So that really allows us to work incredibly closely with the Americans and, of course, any other allied navy who's also similarly equipped with such a data links to really coordinate those, the air defense mission. And of course, historically, at least, ever since we've had the Halifax-class frigates, they've been incorporated and been a part of quite a number of U.S. carrier deployments. And so they often ride, they sail alongside U.S. carrier task groups, when they're abroad overseas. I think, during Operation Apollo or, counterterrorism missions in the Indian Ocean in the aftermath of 9/11, some of our frigates actually had a command role within U.S. carrier task groups in charge of that kind of air warfare and task group defense missions. So definitely we have that kind of integration with American carrier strike groups heavily in mind when we're thinking about what should the CSC be capable of doing and how they should slot in and cater to American interests in that regard. And more broadly speaking, in terms of the U.S.-Canadian cooperation, at the low level, most recently we had our annual Arctic naval exercise, Operation Nanook. Well, Operation Nanook's year-long, but there's a special segment related to the naval portion of it. And this year we had the Americans, both the Navy in one of their Arleigh-Burke destroyers and the Coast Guard in a couple of their medium endurance vessels, sailing alongside Canadian ships and Danish ships, and even a French one too, over in the Davis Strait. I think it was August of this year. So it's definitely happening there. And of course, at a very high level, we have a Canadian Rear Admiral who's actually the vice commander of the American Second Fleet. And so that really shows, how Canada is viewed by the Americans in terms of their role in the Atlantic defense mission. We've also been, part of a number of partner nations that were involved in recent so-called Fourth Battle of the Atlantic tabletop exercise. So, we're participating in that one as well. And of course, more, in the North American sense, we're also part of, NORAD. And, NORAD has a maritime warning mission. And so, of course, we work very closely in that regard as well. In terms of directed energy weapons for CSC, we haven't read much about that, aside from, Canadian officers and admirals speaking in regards to CSCs, that they were focused more on the leading edge of technology, not the cutting edge of technology, or not the bleeding edge of technology. And so it's very much based on, well, what's the best that we can reasonably get right now that we're fairly confident will actually work. We're not going to place our bets on, technologies that are, still very much in the trial and development, just the conceptual phase, such as lasers and railguns and whatnot. And I'm not actually sure about the power generation capacity of CSC's current power plant and whether it'll support such weapons. I mean, the SPY-7 itself is already going to be a significant power drain compared to the baseline Type 26 design. So I'm not sure how much more extra power is available in the design to support such weapons. Of course, as efficiencies develop in the new technologies, the power draw would be less for the same output. So things might still work out well, but we aren't really talking too much about ensuring that we can actually put lasers on board, just because it's one of those things that it's off in the future. Maybe some other people know better about, Type 26's power output and power generation, but of course, it's one of those things that we're not doing a very good job, at least Navy. It's not doing a very good job of, being open about, because, a lot of it's still currently in that spiral design stage of, requirements reconciliation. So, a lot of things still up in the air.
Thank you. Peter?
So I think it's again, just say I'm speaking for myself and not for the Navy or anyone else, but I think it's important to note that Canada has been an excellent partner over the years in contributing to NATO, NATO the SNIGMs, to counter piracy and this, and they've punched above their weight, if you want to put it that way, with their willingness to deploy and take part and exercise in operations. There's been some small rubs on questions of freedom of navigation operations and the like, but what I think is that there's real room for closer relationships because there are real mutual interests engaged, and this is largely part of the Arctic's problem set. Canada obviously has an enormous border with the Arctic region and is part of the Arctic region. Both the United States and Canada share a presence on the Arctic Council. The United States has Arctic, or at least below this in the circle in Alaska. And as the ice opens and passages becomes more likely in the coming, this is really an area where the United States and Canada can join forces in a leadership role, particularly if the Russians are not willing, if Russia is not willing to collaborate with the other Arctic states. Canada and the United States are prominent here. And in many ways, the United States needs Canada because we don't have the ice-hardened hulls, the icebreakers, the critical infrastructure in the north that will be necessary to play a stronger role. I don't want to militarize or securitize the Arctic problem set, but the critical infrastructure and the sorts of ships and aircrafts and communication systems required in that region really bode well if the Biden administration can tighten relationships with Ottawa for a collaborative and cooperative future. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I want to give Barry Walker the chance to post his comment, but before he does, I'll ask Henrik Schilling to put the link for the next sessions into the chat box, because we'll be over time in just a few minutes. I think we'll give it a few minutes, and of course you're free to stay around for a little bit. But those who have to bail at 30 minutes past the hour, thank you for being here, and we would be thankful if you would join us next month. We'll have a week with 2 sessions, but you can register with the link, using the link in the chat box. Barry, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian. My name is Barry Walker. I'm with the Naval Association of Canada, and in a past life, I was the Director of Command, Control, and Information Systems for the Canadian Navy. Tim, thank you for your presentation. Peter, also thank you for yours. They were most informative. One comment that I wanted to make when we were talking about Canada as a medium-sized naval power is that the level of ambition is not solely determined by the number of hulls that you have in the water. Canada has devoted an awful lot of time and effort to developing the institutional capability to exercise command and control and to generate maritime domain awareness. So when we come to talking about Canada as a medium power or a slightly more than medium power, it's important to note that we currently have 2 commanders at sea commanding multinational task forces, which most small navies cannot do. We've just completed command of SNMG-1 with the first woman to command a multinational task force. We have a history of that kind of capability, and we spend an awful lot of time and effort in developing the capabilities that are required to exercise fleet control. So that gives us more naval power than perhaps is justified by the number of hulls. And that was just a comment to put forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very important comment indeed. Tim or Peter, do you want to respond to that?
I mean, I can't really disagree with it. It's certainly the case, although one must be reminded also that Denmark is currently in command of the Strait of Hormuz Maritime Security Task Force that's happening there as well. So in terms of, whether participation at command level for regional security architectures, naval security architectures, does that make you a medium, small, large, whatever Navy? I mean, actually for my dissertation, trying to move beyond the, the size as a category for a Navy, because, what Navy does is much more important than, all these sort of very arbitrary measures of, how big, how small they are. But, it's just for a very relative sense of how we compare, navies across the board. There's always exceptions. There's always going to be special capabilities that they specialize in that regard. So, yeah.
I agree with the general comment, and I also think Tim's right about and I did it in my own presentations because it's convenient, talking about, the size of the Navy is related to ships versus capabilities versus unique capabilities versus geography. Canada plays a role because of its geography, at least in the Arctic case. So I wholeheartedly agree that, there's real contributions to be made for lots of navies, and particularly Canada itself.
Thank you. Tim, of course, with myself and Jeremy, at least, there's two people here who are more than interested in your ranking of navies chapter. I think that's something that I certainly have been looking at deeply. Jeremy has been doing it for his dissertation, and fingers crossed for your publication and dissertation too. With that, thank you very much to Tim and to Peter for being here today. Really appreciate it. And there's a function on the bottom of your screen where you can clap a hand or do a thumbs up for the speakers in lieu of a real clapping. If you enjoyed today's presentation, fear not, it'll be uploaded in the course of the next few days on our YouTube channel, and we'll post it also on Twitter. Follow us at Sea Power Series. If you liked it, tell everyone around you to join the next seminars. If you didn't like it, just tell me and we'll sort it out. Just be well in the next coming days, and have a good day, good evening, good night, wherever you may roam. Thank you.